They didn't just arrest her. They humiliated her. On the concrete. In daylight. In front of phones, people, and the very system she had spent her life protecting. It started like every other day she walked through the world in her skin, with a quiet awareness that being a black woman in America meant always walking the line between dignity and danger. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment when two officers, arrogant, careless, and drunk with power, mistook her silence for submission and her skin for suspicion. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't interfering. She was just standing there, across the street from a gas station, recording what anyone with a conscience would have recorded, a young black boy getting his head slammed against a police car for absolutely nothing. No weapon. No raised voice. Just brown skin, baggy jeans, and fear in his eyes. She had seen this story 1,000 times from a desk. On surveillance feeds. In court testimonies. But this time, she saw it through her own phone lens. And just like that, she became part of the scene. One of the officers looked over, eyes narrowing, and started walking toward her. She held her phone up a little higher. Calm. Composed. Professional. Then came the voice, sharp like broken glass. Turn that camera off. Right now. She didn't move. Didn't flinch. Her fingers held steady on the screen, already recording. The officer stepped closer. You deaf or just too damn stupid to follow instructions? Her voice, when she finally answered, was low, firm, and without hesitation. I have every legal right to record this. That was the spark. His hand shot forward, slapped the phone from her grip. It hit the pavement, still rolling. She barely had time to react before the second officer came up from behind, yanked her arms, twisted them, slammed her face first against the hood of a car. People gasped. A few screamed. The boy being arrested shouted, she didn't do nothing. She didn't even say anything. But they didn't listen. They never do. One of them laughed. You think you're somebody? Huh? Standing there with your little phone, pretending to know the law. You really don't want to do this, she muttered, her cheek pressed to cold metal. Shut the hell up. You have no idea who I am. And he chuckled. A mean, ugly sound. Yeah. You Michelle Obama or something. I'm warning you. He leaned down close to her ear, voice low and mocking. You can warn me from jail, sweetheart. They charged her with obstruction of justice. Resisting arrest. Interfering with an investigation. Said she was impersonating a federal agent when she told them her credentials. One of them even took a photo of her face on the sidewalk. Called it evidence. But the phone was still rolling. On the ground. The whole time. The footage showed everything, the moment she pulled her phone out, the calm way she stood, the way she was tackled, manhandled, degraded. It showed her not being a threat. It showed her being black. And that alone was all it took for them to unleash their power. They put her in the back of the squad car like she was nothing. Drove her downtown. Laughed the whole ride. Took her prints. Took her mugshot. Denied her the chance to make a call. Said she'd be held overnight, just to teach her a lesson. But she already knew the lesson. She had lived it. Every day. What they didn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, was that the woman they were trying to break was the one person in the country who had the power to break them. Because this wasn't just any woman. She was the chief of the FBI. The highest-ranking black woman in federal law enforcement. And her silence that day. It wasn't fear. It was restraint. She wasn't just passing through that gas station. She was working an active internal investigation on racial profiling and systemic corruption within local law enforcement. The very department those two officers belonged to had been under her radar for months. That neighborhood. That precinct. That exact squad car. Every piece had been mapped, tracked, documented. And the incident they thought was just another throwaway arrest became the final piece of a puzzle she had been building for over a year. By the time her real identity was confirmed, it was already too late for them. The footage had gone viral. Internal Affairs had been notified. Federal prosecutors were already making calls. She walked out of that holding cell with her badge in hand and her head held high, escorted by federal agents who addressed her as "ma'am." The officers? They didn't just lose their badges. They lost their reputations. Their pensions. Their futures. The moment her identity was revealed, the public turned. The press turned. The system they had relied on to protect their behavior crumbled. One of them tried to plead ignorance. Said she'd never identified herself properly. Another cried during the deposition, saying he feared for his life. But the truth was laid bare in digital high definition, broadcast across every screen in America. They humiliated a federal officer on the basis of race. But what shocked the nation wasn't just who she was. It was what she did next. Because instead of vengeance, she chose justice. She didn't just press charges, she exposed the entire chain of command that allowed that behavior to fester. Captains. Chiefs. Union reps. The blue wall cracked, then shattered. And at the end of it all, she stood before a podium, not to brag, but to demand change. She didn't need to raise her voice to make the world listen. Her silence had already said enough. Her badge spoke louder than any words. But the question everyone keeps asking is, why didn't she say who she was the second they laid hands on her? And the answer to that is what makes this story unforgettable. To every black viewer watching this, we see you, we stand with you, and we support you. Here at Plow of Twist, we firmly reject any form of racism, prejudice, or injustice. Your story, your strength, and your voice matter, and they deserve to be heard. Now sit back and get ready for a story that will move you, challenge you, and empower you. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. We're telling the stories that others are afraid to. Enjoy the story. In the city of Richmond, Virginia, just blocks away from where civil rights protests had once shaken the soil, a woman named Ayanna lived in quiet defiance of every limitation society had ever placed on her. She was 42 years old, with a calm that didn't beg for attention but commanded respect in every room she entered. Tall, sharply dressed, and deeply observant, Ayanna wasn't someone you'd find making speeches or taking selfies on the front lines. She didn't have to shout her presence into the world. She had earned it through grit, discipline, and a long, unforgiving climb to the top of one of the most powerful institutions in the country, the FBI. But Richmond didn't know that. To most people, she was just another black woman moving through the city with quiet confidence, blending into her surroundings, unnoticed, until someone decided she didn't belong. Ayanna had grown up just an hour south in a small town near Petersburg, raised by her grandmother after her mother died young. Her upbringing had been built on structure and silence. There were no excuses in her household. You didn't complain. You performed. You rose above. And Ayanna did, every single time. By the age of 17, she had already secured a full scholarship to Howard University. By 23, she was being recruited out of law school into federal service. At 30, she was leading field operations across 3 states. By 40, she became the youngest black woman to ever serve as assistant director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. But no one in Richmond knew that when she moved back 2 years ago, intentionally choosing to live in a community where her presence could be quiet, unassuming, and yet deeply rooted. Ayanna lived in the Brooklyn Park neighborhood, an area slowly recovering from decades of systemic neglect. She didn't live behind gates or marble walls. She chose a modest, brick 2-story house at the corner of a leafy block, with a porch where she'd sit most evenings with a glass of tea and a book. She walked her dog at 6 a.m. every morning. Wore sneakers and hoodies on weekends. Shopped locally. Knew her neighbors' names. And every now and then, when someone asked what she did, she'd smile and say she worked in federal operations, a vague response that discouraged further questions. Not because she was ashamed of her position, but because she had learned the power of being underestimated. Ayanna's personal life was as tightly managed as her career. Divorced at 35, no children, no time for relationships that didn't match her pace. Her closest friend was her goddaughter, a 19-year-old student named Brielle, whose mother had once served under Ayanna during a domestic terrorism investigation in the Midwest. Brielle visited often, sometimes just to eat real food, sometimes to talk about classes or life, and sometimes just to sit in silence with Ayanna, whose presence had always made her feel grounded and safe. To Brielle, Ayanna wasn't just a role model, she was a fortress. The kind of woman who made you feel like the world couldn't touch you as long as you stayed near. But the city didn't see Ayanna that way. Richmond had a long memory and short patience. Blackness in power was still an anomaly. Blackness in silence was seen as arrogance. People noticed Ayanna when she walked into rooms, not because of her resume, but because they couldn't quite place her. And what they couldn't place, they often dismissed, or feared. That Saturday morning had started like all the others. Ayanna woke up early, fed her dog, and decided to drive across town for her usual coffee run. She took Brielle's car that day, her own was in for maintenance. It was an older model sedan, reliable but dented, the kind of car no one looked twice at. She liked the anonymity. She liked blending in. But on her way back, just after stopping at a corner gas station to pick up a newspaper and bottled water, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. A group of officers were pinning a teenager, a boy who couldn't have been older than 15, against the hood of a police cruiser. He was trembling. His voice cracking as he tried to speak, but every time he opened his mouth, one of the officers would bark something louder. There were no weapons. No resisting. Just fear. Pure, thick fear in the air. And Ayanna knew it too well. She had seen it on surveillance tapes. Heard it in interviews. She could smell the heat of injustice from across the street. So she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and began to record. She didn't yell. She didn't cross the street. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, focused, silent, documenting. Not because she needed proof, she already knew what this was, but because she needed to protect that boy in the only way she could in that moment. And in less than 60 seconds, she went from observer to target. The taller officer, white, stocky, mid-40s, turned his head and saw her. He tapped his partner. A moment passed. They didn't hesitate. Both began walking toward her. Ayanna didn't move. She knew how to hold her ground. Her phone stayed level, recording everything. When the first officer approached, he gestured sharply with his hand and barked, "Turn that damn thing off. Right now." His partner added, "You interfering with police procedure." Ayanna kept her eyes on the screen. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk," she said. "Recording is legal." The first officer stepped closer, his face flushed. "Don't care. Turn it off. You want to get arrested today?" What happened next wasn't a blur, Ayanna remembered every detail. The way his hand struck her wrist, knocking the phone to the ground. The sound of the screen cracking on impact. The force of his partner grabbing her arm and twisting it back. The sharp sting of metal cuffs snapping into place. Her body pressed hard against the side of the car. Her cheek against cold metal. People began yelling. Someone shouted, "She didn't do anything." A woman screamed, "She's just filming." But the officers didn't care. The moment Ayanna said, "You really don't want to do this," one of them responded, "Oh yeah. Why's that? You got a YouTube channel?" She didn't resist. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. Because she knew, deep down, this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been silenced in that same way. They shoved her into the back of the cruiser. Took her downtown. No questions. No explanations. They processed her like she was nobody. Kept her in holding. Her name meant nothing to them. Her dignity, even less. At the station, an officer behind the desk, younger, black, clearly uncomfortable, asked under his breath, Are you really who I think you are?" She didn't answer. She simply looked at him. Long measured. Cold. And in that silence, he understood more than words ever could. What Ayanna knew, and what none of them did, was that this wasn't an unfortunate mistake. It was the system functioning exactly how it was designed to. And as she sat in that gray holding cell, her hands clasped in her lap, she didn't rage or cry. She planned. She thought about the faces of the officers. The tone in their voices. The pattern of their behavior. She reviewed everything she had seen. Everything she had heard. And she waited. Because Ayanna didn't just carry a badge. She carried decades of knowledge, strategy, and access. She had built her career by studying behavior, how people responded under pressure, how power distorted judgment, how systems shielded the guilty. And in that moment, stripped of her title and reduced to just another black body in a cell, she made a decision. This wouldn't be handled quietly. Not this time. But what she didn't know, what would soon shake her, was that the moment her phone hit the ground, the world began watching. The footage survived. The truth had already started leaking out. And the city of Richmond was about to learn who they had really put in handcuffs. What happens when the system targets the wrong woman? What happens when power meets purpose in silence? And how far will justice go, when it's personal? The light inside the holding cell flickered every so often, casting thin shadows that danced across the concrete floor like quiet reminders of just how low someone could be brought in a matter of minutes. Ayanna sat on the cold bench, hands resting in her lap, back straight, eyes fixed on the door that had slammed shut hours earlier. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't made a phone call. She didn't ask for anything. She simply waited, her thoughts threading through everything she had seen, heard, and endured that morning. The quiet buzz of the fluorescent light above was nothing compared to the weight of humiliation still pressing on her chest. And yet, beneath the calm surface, something was growing. Something slow, calculated, patient. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about what came next. Down the hallway, the younger black officer, Officer Reggie Monroe, paced outside the processing room. He'd recognized Ayanna the moment her name came across his screen, but he hadn't said anything. Not to his superiors. Not to the other officers. Just a long breath and a tightening in his chest. She was a living legend in federal law enforcement circles, especially among black agents. Her career was something they whispered about in training halls. And now, here she was, fingerprinted, cuffed, and locked up like any other name on the intake log. He had been afraid to speak up, not because he didn't believe in her, but because he knew what kind of fallout it would cause. And now, his silence was eating at him. In the break room, the two officers responsible for the arrest, Dan Keller and Mike Sanders, sat slouched in their chairs, cups of coffee in hand, laughing under their breath about camera warriors and wannabe lawyers. Keller, the stockier one, shook his head as he scrolled through his phone. "Did you see her face when we cuffed her? Like we just insulted the Queen of England or something." Sanders snorted. "She really thought we were gonna back down just because she quoted some law she saw on YouTube." Neither of them had checked the footage. Neither of them knew what had been caught. They didn't care. This wasn't the first time they'd done it, and it likely wouldn't have been the last. Their arrogance had always been their armor. Back in the cell, Ayanna finally stood up when she heard the footsteps approaching. A tall white man in a blazer opened the door, holding a folder and trying his best to look unfazed. "Miss Johnson," he said, voice flat, "we're releasing you." Charges dropped. Ayanna looked him in the eye without moving. He shifted slightly. "You're free to go." She didn't respond. Just brushed past him, walking with the kind of grace that made silence feel like a speech. Outside the station, the morning had shifted into afternoon. The air was heavy, thick with humidity and tension. Ayanna didn't get in a car. She walked. Block after block, the weight of everything pressing down but never breaking her posture. She didn't cry. Not yet. She wouldn't give the day that victory. Instead, she arrived at her home, stepped inside, and sat down at her kitchen table like it was just another Tuesday. The only difference now was the phone call she was about to make. That night, Brielle arrived with tears already forming in her eyes. "I saw the video," she said, voice trembling. "Somebody uploaded it, you can hear you saying, you don't want to do this, and then they just slammed you." Ayanna reached across the table, placing a firm hand over Brielle's. "I'm okay," she said quietly. "But this isn't about me anymore." Brielle's jaw clenched. "It is about you. They humiliated you like you were nothing." Ayanna nodded, her eyes heavy but sharp. "And now they're going to learn exactly who I am." What began that night was not a campaign of vengeance, but a strategy of exposure. Ayanna didn't go to the press. Not yet. She went to the Office of Professional Responsibility. She documented every step of the arrest, filed an internal report, and escalated it through the proper channels. Her name alone sent shockwaves through the corridors. Meetings were scheduled. Faces turned pale. At first, everyone thought it would be handled quietly, a closed-door apology, maybe a quiet reassignment of the officers. But that wasn't enough. Not this time. Because what Ayanna had seen, what she had endured, was just one drop in a poisoned well. And she knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this was her moment, not to retaliate, but to reveal. Meanwhile, Richmond buzzed with tension. The video had gone viral. Local news picked it up. Then regional. Then national. They didn't know her name yet, only that a black woman had been tackled and cuffed while silently recording police misconduct. Protesters gathered outside the station within days. "She could be any of us," read one sign. "We are watching," read another. The department issued a vague statement about ongoing review and full cooperation, but the streets weren't convinced. People wanted accountability. At a private meeting downtown, Ayanna sat across from the Richmond police commissioner, an older man named Harold Whitmore, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Ayanna," he began, I didn't know it was you." "If I had," she cut him off. "It shouldn't have to be me for this to matter." He rubbed his temples, defeated. "We can handle this internally. We'll suspend them, maybe even terminate if," her voice was steady, lethal. "No. We're not burying this. We're cleaning it." He looked at her, truly looked, and realized he was no longer speaking to a peer. He was speaking to someone with the power to dismantle everything. Days passed. Keller and Sanders were placed on administrative leave, but Ayanna knew it was performative. She knew how this worked. But then something unexpected happened. A second video surfaced, from inside the station, showing Sanders mocking Ayanna's arrest to a colleague. "She said we didn't want to do this," he laughed. "Like she's some kind of secret agent. Hell, she looked like she just got off the bus from Newark." That clip hit harder than the first. It wasn't just brutality anymore. It was mockery. Disdain. Open racism. The internet exploded. Ayanna's face, once shielded by silence, was now on every screen. Reporters camped outside her house. Advocacy groups begged her to speak. Political leaders issued statements. And still, Ayanna said nothing. Not yet. She was preparing something else. Something final. One night, Reggie, the young officer, showed up at her door, hat in hand. "I should have said something," he whispered. "I recognized you." I froze. Ayanna didn't scold him. She saw herself in him, the weight of loyalty versus justice. You didn't freeze, she said. You survived. But now, you need to decide who you're surviving for. Reggie nodded slowly. I want to help. I want to testify. I've seen things, those two, others, stuff nobody ever reports. I've got names. Ayanna stepped aside and let him in. With every passing hour, the case grew. What started as a viral moment turned into a federal investigation. Testimonies, statements, evidence, it all built toward something undeniable. The question wasn't if something explosive was coming. It was when. And what kind of destruction it would leave behind. Ayanna stood at the edge of her porch the night before the hearing, watching the streetlights flicker over the quiet block. Brielle stood beside her, arms crossed, heart racing. Are you nervous? She asked. Ayanna shook her head. I'm not nervous, she said. I'm ready. Then she turned to Brielle and whispered, they thought they arrested a stranger. But tomorrow, they're going to realize they arrested a storm. And just like that, the world waited. Because no one, not the officers, not the city, not even the country, was ready for what she was about to reveal. The morning of the internal hearing began with a heavy sky, as if the atmosphere itself could feel what was coming. Inside the Richmond Federal Building, the air was tense, sterile, controlled, but under that thin layer of professionalism was a pressure building like a held breath. Word had spread quickly over the past few days. Not just about the viral video, not just about the public outrage, but about the woman at the center of it all. The same woman whose arrest had sparked protests, whose silence had raised questions, and whose identity, when finally revealed, had sent tremors through every level of law enforcement in the state. Everyone now knew her name. Ayanna Johnson. The chief of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The woman who had walked into their station in a hoodie, filmed a crime in progress, and walked out as a symbol of everything the system didn't want to face. In a windowless room on the 4th floor, the officers involved sat at one side of a long wooden table. Dan Keller, jaw set, eyes scanning the space like he was preparing for a war he couldn't understand. Mike Sanders looked slightly more rattled, beads of sweat forming at his temple, fingers tapping against the folder in front of him. Their lawyers sat beside them, straight-faced, whispering instructions. Behind them, a handful of department heads, legal counsel, and observers watched silently, waiting for the session to begin. The door opened slowly. Ayanna stepped in. She didn't walk in with a crowd. No fanfare. No entourage. Just her. Dressed in a fitted navy suit, heels clicking softly against the floor, a leather folder in one hand and absolute focus in her eyes. She paused only briefly, scanning the room with a gaze that never asked for permission. She didn't nod. Didn't smile. She simply sat down at the head of the table across from them, opened her folder, and said, "Let's begin." For a moment, no one moved. Keller leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something sharp. His attorney raised a hand. "Excuse me, before we proceed, I'd like clarification. Is this a deposition or a disciplinary inquiry?" Ayanna didn't even glance at him. She spoke to the room. "This is a formal oversight hearing, requested by the Office of Professional Responsibility. You're not on trial, not yet. But you will answer." One of the department officials cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Agent Johnson, Director," she corrected, her voice calm, direct, and icy. "Director Johnson." The room shifted. Her title alone changed the energy. It wasn't just a formality. It was a reminder. Of authority. Of rank. Of everything they failed to see that day on the street. The first half of the session moved like a slow burn. Video evidence played on a large screen. Footage from Ayanna's phone. Footage from a nearby business's security camera. Footage from inside the precinct showing Sanders mocking her. The room watched in uncomfortable silence as the events unfolded in undeniable clarity. No yelling. No aggression. Just Ayanna, standing, filming, then being attacked. Keller folded his arms. You can't hear the whole thing. Maybe she said something threatening before the footage starts. Ayanna didn't look at him. She just asked, are you suggesting I provoked your actions? I'm saying context matters. So let's talk context, she said, flipping a page. Your record shows 6 prior complaints of excessive force. 2 involving minors. 3 involving black civilians. All dismissed due to insufficient evidence. She turned to Sanders. And you, multiple suspensions for insubordination, including verbal threats to a civilian during a traffic stop. Do you consider that context? Sanders opened his mouth but said nothing. The room was still. The officials exchanged glances, their discomfort growing. No one had expected her to come this prepared. But it wasn't just about preparation. It was about precision. Reggie Monroe entered halfway through, summoned as a witness. His testimony was soft but damning. He recounted the jokes. The whispers. The culture that enabled the behavior. He looked at Ayanna only once, offering a nod not of apology, but of alignment. She gave nothing away, just listened. Measured. Focused. As the hours passed, the defense began to crack. The officers tried to justify their actions, but every excuse sounded thinner under the weight of evidence. We thought she was interfering. She didn't comply fast enough. We felt threatened. And with each statement, Ayanna asked calmly, did you feel threatened because of her actions? Or because of who she was? Finally, after hours of testimony, Ayanna closed her folder, leaned forward, and said something that silenced the room entirely. You thought you were doing your job. You thought you were dealing with another anonymous face, another voice you didn't have to listen to. You didn't know you were targeting a federal agent. That's your excuse. But here's what matters, it shouldn't take a badge to be treated like a human being. No one spoke. Then, slowly, Ayanna reached beneath the table and placed a second folder on top of the first. This isn't just about me. Over the past 2 years, I've been conducting an internal investigation into systemic racial misconduct across multiple departments, including this one. 37 civilians. 18 officers. 7 captains. All linked by patterns of abuse, neglect, and cover-ups. And now, thanks to this incident, the final link has been confirmed. The officials froze. What you triggered, she continued, wasn't just a scandal. It was a doorway. And behind that door is every suppressed complaint, every silenced voice, every piece of evidence that this department worked so hard to bury. Keller stood up suddenly, voice raised, this is a setup. Ayanna didn't blink. No. This is accountability. The hearing dissolved into chaos. Lawyers objected. Officials scrambled. Phones lit up. But Ayanna remained seated, watching the cracks form. Not with rage. Not with satisfaction. But with purpose. Because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and turned toward the door. As she reached it, a voice called from behind, Sanders, eyes wide, sweat dripping, voice desperate. Why didn't you say something that day? Why didn't you just tell us who you were? Ayanna turned, her eyes steady. Because I shouldn't have to. And with that, she walked out, leaving behind a room full of men who, for the first time in their careers, were forced to sit with the weight of their own decisions. But outside that room, the world was already watching. And what came next would shake the foundation of the very system they once believed would protect them. As Ayanna stepped out of the federal building and into the thick, humid air, the silence outside was more suffocating than the noise she had left behind. Reporters stood behind barricades like statues, microphones poised, cameras aimed, but no one dared shout a question. Not yet. She walked slowly, deliberately, every step echoing the weight of the room she'd just left. She didn't stop. Didn't glance at the crowd. Her silence was more commanding than 100 press releases. She reached the black SUV waiting at the curb, opened the door, and sat in the back seat. Only then did she exhale, a deep, long breath, not of relief, but of release. Reggie was in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel like it was holding him together. He didn't speak until the vehicle was in motion. "I thought I was ready," he said finally, eyes on the road. "I really did. But when they called you a liar to your face in that room, when they looked you in the eye and still tried to spin the story," he shook his head, jaw clenched. "I almost lost it." Ayanna didn't respond right away. Her gaze was fixed outside the window, watching the city blur past. "They weren't lying to me," she said eventually, voice low but steady. "They were lying to themselves. They still think the truth bends to their comfort." Reggie glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes filled with something between awe and sorrow. "They're going to fall apart after this. You know that, right? Keller, Sanders, the command structure, it won't hold." Ayanna finally looked at him through the mirror, her expression unreadable. "That's not my goal. I don't want them to fall. I want the system that allowed them to rise to be rebuilt." Back at the station, chaos had erupted. The moment Ayanna dropped the second folder, the one filled with 2 years of names, dates, testimonies, and internal patterns, every line of defense collapsed. Officers scrambled to review their own files, terrified of what might be in the documents she possessed. Phone calls between captains turned frantic. The chief of police held an emergency press conference that afternoon, sweat glistening under the hot lights, stumbling through promises of transparency and immediate suspension of all involved personnel. But the public wasn't buying it. Not this time. Because this time, the story had a face. And that face was the highest-ranking black woman in federal law enforcement. Later that night, Brielle sat with Ayanna in the quiet of the living room, her knees pulled up to her chest, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they'll ever actually get it?" she asked. Do you think they'll ever really understand what they did?" Ayanna stared into her untouched cup of tea. "Understanding would require empathy. And empathy requires that you first believe we're human." Brielle's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "You could have stayed silent. You could have taken the apology, let them do damage control. Why go through all this?" Ayanna's eyes met hers, unwavering. "Because silence is how they win. Every time we swallow our rage, every time we accept the apology instead of demanding change, the cycle resets. I didn't speak for me. I spoke for the girl who can't speak, for the boy who didn't survive, for the mother burying her son." At the same time, across town, Keller and Sanders were being escorted from their homes, not in handcuffs, not yet, but under internal order for immediate leave pending investigation. Keller's face was twisted in disbelief as he barked into his phone, "She set us up, man. She was bait. This whole thing was a setup." His lawyer tried to calm him, but Keller's voice only grew louder. "She wanted us to snap, and we did. That's entrapment." In a separate office, Sanders sat in silence, eyes red, staring at the footage playing for the third time on a small screen in front of him. It was his voice. His laugh. The slurs muttered under his breath. His mockery inside the precinct. All of it. The more he watched, the more his face collapsed inward. "I didn't think she was anyone important," he whispered. "I didn't know." The internal review expanded rapidly. Names that had previously disappeared from complaints resurfaced. Records that had been buried under administrative error were suddenly restored. Ayanna had not only opened the door, she had handed the public the blueprint of the entire structure. More officers came forward. Some out of guilt. Some out of fear. Others because they finally felt like they could. Reggie helped coordinate testimonies, organizing meetings in safe spaces, listening to stories that sounded too familiar. Stories of black citizens treated like threats, of misconduct swept away like dust, of a culture built not on justice, but on silence and protectionism. A week after the hearing, Ayanna was invited to speak at a nationally televised town hall. The invitation came with caveats, assurances, suggested talking points. She ignored them all. Standing under the bright studio lights, she addressed not the panel of officials sitting to her left, but the camera in front of her. The people. The community. The ones who have been watching since day one. "I am not a hero," she said, voice steady, eyes direct. "I'm not exceptional. I am the result of what happens when a little black girl grows up knowing her life is not up for negotiation. I stood where I stood because I had to. Because silence, in a system built to mute you, is compliance. I didn't reveal who I was because I wanted the world to see what happens when we stop asking for respect and start demanding accountability. I didn't want special treatment. I wanted equal protection. And I will not stop until that protection is real, consistent, and guaranteed, not just for me, but for every black child who dares to grow up free." The applause wasn't immediate. It was heavy. Stunned. Slowly rising. Not performative, but earned. Even those who didn't know her name before that day would never forget it after. Back in Richmond, the department underwent its first full external audit in over 2 decades. Several resignations followed. A handful of officers were removed. Charges were brought. Policies were rewritten. And still, Ayanna refused interviews from the biggest networks. She let the story breathe on its own. The footage. The words. The data. Let people sit with it. One afternoon, as she sat with Brielle on the porch, watching the wind rustle through the trees, Brielle asked softly, "Do you think it'll really change anything?" Ayanna leaned back, eyes on the sky. "I think change isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a seed. Sometimes it's the moment someone sees themselves in your story and realizes they're not alone. Sometimes it's when the ones who caused harm are finally forced to feel the weight of it." Then, after a pause, she added, "And sometimes, change is just making it impossible for the world to look away again." Brielle looked down at her phone, scrolling through hundreds of messages, posts, support from strangers across the country. "They're calling you a storm," she said, smiling faintly. Ayanna shook her head slowly. "No. I'm just the lightning. The storm was already here. But what came next would prove that the lightning strike had already set everything ablaze, and the fire wasn't going out anytime soon." The days that followed were not quiet. They were filled with a strange, dissonant noise, a mix of celebration, denial, fear, and reckoning. The system Ayanna had exposed was no longer just under scrutiny, it was unraveling, piece by piece, like thread pulled from a tightly wound knot that had held for far too long. But victory, even when long overdue, did not feel simple. The exposure had been necessary, the truth unavoidable, and yet, what remained in the aftermath was complex, messy, and profoundly human. Consequences didn't fall into neat categories of justice and punishment. They spilled over into real lives, into homes and hearts, challenging everyone involved to confront what they had chosen to ignore for so long. Within the Richmond Police Department, fractures appeared that had nothing to do with Ayanna's investigation and everything to do with the silence that had enabled the officers she exposed. Younger officers who had long stayed quiet began stepping forward with their own accounts, some shared stories of subtle retaliation, others admitted they'd been too afraid to speak. The older ranks, those who had built careers around the unspoken rule of loyalty above integrity, struggled to accept that the old codes no longer held power. Meetings became battlegrounds. Retirements were pushed forward. Trust eroded not just with the public, but within the department walls. What Ayanna had ignited wasn't just an institutional reform, it was a cultural rupture. But not everyone saw it that way. There were pockets of resistance. Statements that questioned her intentions. Whispers of ambition disguised as justice. Commentators began to dissect her silence during the arrest, framing it as a calculated move. Some suggested she'd staged the incident to strengthen her personal brand or position within federal leadership. Ayanna knew that would come. She had anticipated the attempts to reframe her actions, to recast her as opportunistic. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. Sitting in her office one afternoon, reading an editorial that questioned whether her actions had deepened the divide between law enforcement and the community, Ayanna felt the familiar weight pressing down. She didn't respond publicly. She didn't explain herself to those who would never understand. She just got back to work. And work, now, meant more than it ever had. The Department of Justice had fast-tracked a new National Review Board to investigate civil rights violations tied to law enforcement. Ayanna had been asked to chair it. The offer came with power, visibility, and resources. But it also came with a cost. Accepting it would mean relocating to Washington full-time, stepping away from her local work in Richmond, and, perhaps most painfully, leaving behind the community that had become her anchor. It wasn't an easy choice. She spent long evenings alone, weighing the impact of leading reform from the top versus staying rooted where the damage had been most personal. The dilemma wasn't just professional, it was deeply moral. Did she have a greater responsibility to the system or to the people affected by it every day? Brielle noticed the change before Ayanna ever spoke about it. One night, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, she asked softly, "Are you leaving?" Ayanna paused, spoon resting in her bowl. "I haven't decided yet," she answered, but her voice carried hesitation. Brielle looked down, playing with the edge of a napkin. "I know it's big. I know you can do more from up there. But it's going to be really hard here without you." Ayanna reached across the table and held her hand. "It's not about leaving you," she said. "It's about building something that makes sure you don't have to keep fighting the same fight I did." Meanwhile, Reggie found himself in a personal storm. His testimony had made him a target inside the department. Some colleagues began to avoid him. Others outright accused him of betrayal. "You snitched on your own," one officer had said in the locker room, his voice dripping with disdain. Reggie tried to ignore it, but the tension was unavoidable. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult shift, he found himself sitting in his car for nearly an hour before driving home. When he finally walked through Ayanna's front door, something he did less often now, he didn't speak right away. Just stood there, shoulders heavy. Ayanna waited. "They're never going to look at me the same again," he finally said. "Even the ones who say they support change, they don't trust me now. I'm the guy who turned on the badge." Ayanna studied him. "You didn't turn on the badge," she said. "You honored it. You gave it the meaning it was supposed to have in the first place." He laughed bitterly. "Tell that to my supervisor. I got reassigned to desk duty." The reality of consequence had many forms. For the officers under investigation, some were suspended pending trial. Others resigned quietly, hoping to disappear into civilian life before the public could remember their names. But the media wasn't finished. The story had become a symbol. Ayanna's face had become the subject of magazine covers and documentaries in progress. Journalists followed her every move, each headline debating whether she was a hero or a disruptor. And Ayanna, more than anyone, understood the danger of being turned into a symbol. Symbols are easier to reframe. Easier to attack. Easier to forget. Still, not all responses were cynical. Across the country, communities began organizing town halls, using her case as a starting point for local reform. A group of young black law students in Chicago launched a program to offer free legal aid for racial profiling cases. A precinct in Oakland announced a new community review board, inspired directly by the policy Ayanna had implemented in Richmond years earlier. These weren't seismic shifts. They were small, local, and fragile. But they were real. Ayanna returned to the gas station where everything had started, standing across the street at the same place she'd held her phone that day. The boy who had been arrested, whose name was Devon, had been released without charges, thanks in part to the video. His family had reached out to thank her. That morning, he met her on the sidewalk. Taller now, less afraid. They stood in silence for a while, cars passing, the city moving around them. Then he said, "I thought I was going to disappear that day. I thought no one was going to see me again." Ayanna looked at him, her voice soft. "I saw you. And now the whole world does." But not everyone was satisfied with the slow process of change. A group of activists demanded immediate firings across multiple departments. Some organized protests at Ayanna's own events, arguing that the system couldn't be reformed from within, that her decision to stay connected to it made her complicit. Ayanna didn't argue back. She understood their anger. She respected their rage. But she also knew that dismantling and rebuilding were not the same. Her approach wasn't about choosing one path over the other. It was about holding space for both. The dilemma she faced grew louder. Stay and continue what she started in Richmond, fighting for change on the ground, among the people who needed it most, or accept the federal position and reshape the very policies that allowed her assault to happen in the first place. Each option carried weight. Each meant leaving something behind. In moments of solitude, Ayanna found herself writing out lists she never finished. Pros and cons, names of people she would miss. Goals she hadn't yet achieved. She didn't know what choice she would make. Not yet. One evening, Brielle handed her a letter. It came to the mailbox. No return address. Ayanna opened it carefully. Inside was a short note, handwritten in careful, almost nervous script. "I don't expect forgiveness. I know what I did was wrong. I know I'm part of the problem. But watching you stand there, after everything we did to you, it changed something in me. I don't know if that matters. But I thought you should know. MS." Ayanna read the letter twice, then folded it gently and placed it in her drawer. Not because it changed anything. But because it reminded her that the line between villain and victim wasn't always as clear as people liked to believe. Humans were messy. Redemption wasn't always deserved, but it was always possible. And sometimes, justice wasn't a clean break. It was a long, hard, uncomfortable process of breaking the cycle. The storm had passed. But the sky hadn't cleared. Not yet. And now, Ayanna stood at the edge of a decision that could alter everything. Where she would go. Who she would be. What kind of legacy she was willing to build, or leave behind. But one thing was certain. The next step would not be made in silence. It was the stillness that got to her most, those early mornings when the sun barely touched the edge of the blinds and the world hadn't started moving yet. That was when the weight crept in. Ayanna had built her life around motion, around strategy, around always being one step ahead. But now, with the dust beginning to settle, there were long stretches of silence where the echoes of everything she had done, everything she had said, came rushing back like a tide. The aftermath was never as loud as the moment itself. It was softer, more dangerous in its subtlety, because it allowed doubt to slip in through the cracks. She stood in front of the mirror, her reflection a mixture of strength and exhaustion. Her face carried the calm of someone who had weathered something too big to describe, but her eyes were heavy, her posture quieter than before. She was still Ayanna Johnson, director, leader, symbol, but there were days when even the title felt distant, as if the woman who had sat at that table, stared down her aggressors, and exposed a corrupt institution belonged to another version of herself. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not the scrutiny. Not the praise. But the question of who she was allowed to be when she wasn't fighting. Reggie came by that afternoon, unannounced, holding 2 coffees and wearing a look that suggested he'd had another long day of whispers and cold stares at the department. He placed the cups on the counter and didn't speak until Ayanna motioned for him to sit. The air between them had grown more comfortable over the weeks, more familiar. What had started as obligation and alliance had slowly turned into something steadier. Mutual respect. A shared understanding that didn't need to be constantly named. He sighed as he sank into the chair, running a hand over his face. "They're transferring me," he said, not looking at her. "Out of Richmond. I didn't even ask. Just got the paperwork this morning." Ayanna paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Where to?" He gave a half smile, tired and hollow. "Somewhere outside of Roanoke. Desk work. Outreach and training. They called it a strategic realignment of resources." She leaned forward, voice low. "And what do you think it really is?" He met her eyes. "A quiet punishment they can't admit to." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached for her coffee, took a sip, then said, "Do you want to fight it?" He let out a dry laugh. "What would that even look like? Sue them? Go public? I don't have your kind of name, Ayanna. They'll spin me into some disgruntled rookie who couldn't take the heat." She nodded slowly, processing, then asked, "Then why are you here?" His voice cracked a little. "Because I needed to say it out loud to someone who would understand what it feels like to do the right thing and still lose." Ayanna's heart clenched at his words, not because they surprised her, but because she had felt the exact same thing nearly every day since the hearing. People on the outside saw her as victorious, as triumphant. But the truth was more complicated. Victory didn't erase the emotional bruises. It didn't give back the time she spent in that cell or remove the looks from people who now saw her as a walking reminder of their complicity. She had changed the narrative, yes, but she had also paid for it with parts of herself that would never return untouched. Later that evening, she found herself sitting on the porch, the air thick with summer and the scent of distant grills and freshly cut grass. Brielle joined her without a word, carrying 2 bowls of ice cream, a quiet peace offering. They sat in silence for a while, until Brielle spoke, her voice cautious but certain. "I think you should take the DC position." Ayanna glanced at her, surprised. "You do?" Brielle nodded, staring out at the street. "Yeah. I've been thinking about it. At first, I didn't want you to go. I didn't want to lose you here. But now I think, maybe they need you there more than we need you here." Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "We?" Brielle smiled, then added, "You've already planted something here. It's growing. People are organizing. Voices are louder. You lit the fire. Maybe now your job is to make sure it doesn't get extinguished somewhere else." Ayanna let the words settle inside her, not rushing to respond. There was truth in what Brielle said, but also a sting. Leadership often meant letting go. And letting go meant trusting that what you'd built could stand without you. That was a hard thing to believe in a world that had taught her time and again that the moment she looked away, things fell apart. But maybe this time, maybe this moment was different. The next morning, she walked into the office and closed the door behind her. On her desk was the letter from the Department of Justice, still unopened. She stared at it for a long time before finally picking it up. She opened it slowly, like it might burst if she moved too fast. Inside was a formal offer. Salary. Role. Expectations. A signature line. No surprises. Just the culmination of years of effort and a single act of truth. She took out a pen. Didn't sign. Not yet. Instead, she opened her email and began writing. Not to accept. Not to decline. But to ask a question, one that had been forming in her heart for days. "If I take this role," she wrote, "will I have the authority to create an independent investigative division with oversight power across all federal and local law enforcement agencies? Will I have real leverage, or just ceremonial influence?" She sent the email without reading it twice. Later that day, her phone rang. It was a voice she hadn't expected, Deputy Attorney General Martin Wells. "Ayanna," he said, "I got your email. And I'm not surprised you asked that. Most people would have jumped at the title. She waited. He continued. We're not offering you this job for decoration. You've proven that you're not just willing to speak truth, but that you know how to build something better. You'll have what you need. And more importantly, you'll have the room to make it matter. She didn't reply with excitement. Just a simple, thank you. Then she hung up. When Reggie came by that evening, she told him she was leaning toward accepting. He smiled, though there was sadness in his eyes. They're lucky, he said. But we're gonna miss you. Ayanna placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm not disappearing. You and Brielle, you're part of this work. And I'm not doing it alone. The city began to shift, slowly but steadily. The cases Ayanna had opened moved forward. Some officers faced charges. Others were permanently removed from duty. Community leaders started hosting monthly forums, funded in part by a quiet grant Ayanna had arranged before even considering leaving. Brielle started volunteering with a youth justice group, helping teens understand their rights and tell their stories. And Reggie, despite the transfer, began mentoring new recruits, refusing to let the culture swallow them the way it almost did him. In her final week in Richmond, Ayanna met with Devon one more time. They sat on a park bench, watching kids play on the swings, their laughter cutting through the warm air. Devon handed her a folded piece of paper. I wrote this for school, he said. We were supposed to write about a person who changed our lives. She unfolded it and read slowly, her chest tightening with every word. He had called her a shield. A mirror. A storm. He wrote about how her silence that day had spoken louder than anything he'd ever seen. And at the bottom, in thick, crooked letters, he'd written, You gave me my future back. Ayanna closed the paper carefully, holding it to her chest. You gave it to yourself, she said. That night, she signed the acceptance letter. But the story wasn't over. Because even as she packed the last box in her home, even as the car pulled out of the driveway and pointed toward D.C., Ayanna knew the hardest part wasn't behind her. The hardest part was making sure the system never forgot her name, not because of who she was, but because of what she refused to accept. And the fire she started in Richmond wasn't just going to spread. It was going to transform. Washington, D.C. had its own rhythm, a sharper pulse, a heavier weight in the air, like every breath carried the gravity of policy, legacy, and watchful eyes. The buildings stood taller, the conversations carried layers, and every handshake came with an invisible set of calculations behind it. Ayanna felt that difference the moment she arrived. Richmond had been rooted in community, in pain and healing side by side. But D.C. was about movement, machinery, and momentum. It wasn't emotional, it was structural. People here didn't talk about justice in whispers or on porches, they talked about it in committee rooms and behind closed doors, dressed in suits and coded in sterile language. And yet, Ayanna walked through these halls with the same deliberate presence she had always carried. She didn't dress it up. Didn't try to blend in. She had arrived as herself, and she wasn't shrinking. Her new office was expansive, lined with bookshelves and polished wood, a skyline view that overlooked the Capitol dome. But Ayanna barely noticed the grandeur. She filled the space not with awards or photos, but with documents, strategy boards, and a small framed picture of her grandmother, placed quietly on the edge of her desk. The work began before she even had time to unpack. Meetings with senators. Calls with civil rights organizations. Briefings with internal policy teams who weren't quite sure whether to be inspired by her or terrified. She didn't smile much. She didn't have to. Her presence said enough. One afternoon, 3 weeks into her new role, she sat across from a senior advisor who had served under 3 different administrations. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes measuring her with the same scrutiny he used for budgets and classified intel. You understand what you're stepping into, right? He said, his tone too polished to be openly confrontational. This isn't Richmond. The people you're pushing against here, they don't care about footage or public outrage. They survive on delay and procedure. Ayanna didn't blink. Then we'll make delay and procedure work for us. He smirked, but there was no amusement in it. You're going to have to compromise. Ayanna leaned forward, her voice low and unwavering. I didn't come here to compromise. I came here to build the thing they've been pretending doesn't exist. Behind her calm resolve, there was exhaustion, but it was an exhaustion born of purpose. Each day brought more resistance. Bureaucratic stall tactics. Politicians sidestepping hard conversations. Departments refusing to release internal data despite executive orders. And yet, she pressed on, building a small team of people who actually believed in the mission. Not the ones seeking credit or promotion, but the ones who had seen the worst and still showed up. People like Javier, a former investigator turned data analyst who'd exposed a regional misconduct pattern in New Mexico and been quietly pushed out. Or Natalie, a compliance officer from Atlanta who had watched 3 years of reports disappear into silence before resigning. They weren't flashy. They were fighters. Quiet ones. Strategic. Loyal. Late one evening, Ayanna walked the empty corridors of the building, papers in hand, and found herself in the briefing room where a dozen policy experts had just cleared out. She stood alone for a moment, the room dimly lit, still warm with tension. The whiteboard still held fragments of a heated debate over qualified immunity reform. Her eyes traced the words as if memorizing the battlefield. That was when Natalie entered, holding a manila folder, her brow furrowed. You need to see this, she said, handing it over. Ayanna opened the file, scanning quickly. Inside were internal complaints from a police union, recent, active, and disturbing. Several involved retaliation against officers who had cooperated with federal oversight. Others showed patterns of tampered evidence reports. Ayanna's jaw tightened. And this is just what we've found in 2 weeks. Natalie nodded. There's more. But they're locking it down. The deeper we dig, the more walls go up. Ayanna exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar weight of resistance. But it was more than that. It was betrayal. These systems, these people, so many of them had pledged reform in front of cameras. And yet here they were, still erasing, still hiding. She sat down at the edge of the table and whispered more to herself than to Natalie, how many more names will it take before they stop seeing this as a trend and start seeing it as a culture? The next morning, she made a decision. Not just to push harder, but to push publicly. In a rare move, she scheduled a press briefing of her own. No filters. No scripted questions. Just truth. The auditorium filled quickly. Journalists, government officials, even activists from across the country packed the room. Some came curious. Others came skeptical. Ayanna stood at the podium, no teleprompter, no prepared statement. She looked out at the sea of faces and began to speak. When I was arrested, she said, her voice calm but sharp, people asked why I didn't reveal who I was. But the question we should be asking is, why did it matter who I was in the first place? Why does a title determine whether a person deserves dignity? Why does a badge change whether someone is believed? She paused, letting the silence stretch. I have seen the system from both sides. I have worked within it, and I have survived it. And what I've learned is this: policy means nothing without enforcement. Statements mean nothing without accountability. And apologies mean nothing without action. She held up the folder Natalie had given her. Inside this are dozens of reports, current ones, showing retaliation, suppression, and systemic obstruction against those trying to tell the truth. This isn't the past. This is now. And we're not waiting for another tragedy to act. The questions that followed were intense. Some challenged her authority. Some questioned her methods. But Ayanna didn't flinch. She answered every question with clarity and force. She didn't cater. She didn't pander. And by the time she left the stage, the room was no longer skeptical. It was stirred. But with every step forward came new risks. That night, as she walked back to her building, a figure waited near the steps. It was Sanders. He looked thinner, older, like life had weathered him fast. She froze, body alert, but he raised his hands. "I'm not here to start anything. I needed to see you. One last time." She didn't invite him to speak, but he continued anyway. "I lost everything," he said. "My badge. My pension. My reputation. My marriage." He looked at her, desperation in his eyes. "And I know I earned it. But every day since, I keep thinking about that moment, about how you looked at me and said, 'You have no idea who I am.' And you were right. I didn't want to. But now I do. And I wish to God I had listened." Ayanna stared at him, her expression unreadable. "And what do you want now? Redemption?" He shook his head slowly. "No. I want to help. However I can. Off the record. No press. No credit." She studied him for a long moment before answering. "Then prove it. Bring me what they're hiding." He nodded, turned, and walked away. Inside, Ayanna sat in her office well into the night, the lights of the city burning behind her. The weight hadn't lessened. The climb hadn't stopped. But now, the path ahead was clearer. She was no longer just reacting to injustice. She was rewriting its blueprint. In the months that followed, the ripple effect of Ayanna's decisions reached farther than anyone expected. The federal oversight unit she established quickly became one of the most feared and respected departments in the nation. Not because it wielded violence or fear, but because it held everyone, no matter their badge, their title, or their tenure, accountable. Complaints that had sat untouched for years were reopened, old cases re-examined, and a culture of silence was slowly, but steadily, dismantled. Departments that had operated unchecked for decades began to change, not because they wanted to, but because they could no longer afford not to. Ayanna's presence had forced a recalibration, and though the system remained flawed, it was no longer untouchable. In D.C., her office became known not for political posturing or surface-level reform, but for radical transparency. Officers, both current and former, reached out to share what they'd seen and experienced. Whistleblowers felt safer. Community leaders were invited into decision-making rooms. Policy wasn't just written, it was enforced. And behind every headline, every bill passed, and every reform implemented, was Ayanna's quiet, relentless determination. She didn't celebrate victories with parades. She measured them in lives spared, in silence broken, in the voice of a mother who called to say, "Thank you for making them see my son as a person." Reggie found purpose in his new position. Despite the attempt to sideline him, he built something real, a training initiative focused on ethics and community policing that soon became a model replicated across the country. Officers under his mentorship began to change the conversation inside the locker rooms and precincts. He never sought praise, but his work quietly shifted the future of the very institution that once tried to isolate him. He and Ayanna kept in touch, not as allies born from crisis, but as partners in a mission bigger than either of them. Their bond was no longer just about survival, it was about building. Brielle blossomed. Inspired by Ayanna's courage and her own proximity to the fight for justice, she changed her major to public policy and began organizing youth-led forums in her city. She spoke on panels, wrote op-eds, and never stopped reminding people that change was personal, not theoretical. Her voice, once hesitant, now carried the same fire she had once only admired in Ayanna. One evening, after returning from a campus event, she called Ayanna and said, "I didn't realize how many people were just waiting for someone to give them permission to care. You gave them that." Ayanna, for once, let the pride show in her smile. As for Mike Sanders, the path he chose surprised even himself. Delivering the internal documents Ayanna requested wasn't redemption, but it was a start. The evidence he brought led to the exposure of a network of cover-ups that traced back nearly a decade. Instead of disappearing, he testified publicly before a federal committee. His voice was shaky, but honest. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't expect applause. But in doing so, he helped dismantle the same wall he once helped build. Afterward, he left law enforcement entirely and began working with a restorative justice program in Baltimore, helping other former officers face the truths they'd buried for years. It didn't absolve him, but it gave him something he'd never had before, direction rooted in humility. Dan Keller's story was different. Unwilling to cooperate, he chose denial to the bitter end. He lost his badge, his pension, and the legal system he once manipulated turned its weight against him. He was charged and convicted for obstruction and civil rights violations. His name became a cautionary tale, not because he was the worst of them, but because he believed he was untouchable. His fall wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. Proof that the culture of silence, if left unchecked, could devour its own. And Ayanna? Her legacy continued to evolve, but it wasn't built on headlines or awards. It was built on moments, on the mother who hugged her outside a courthouse, on the teenage boy who wrote her to say he now wanted to become a civil rights lawyer, on the officer who left a note on her desk that read, "You reminded me why I joined in the first place." Her greatest victory wasn't in exposing the broken system. It was in proving that the system could still be transformed when someone refused to look away. She stood one morning in front of a new class of federal trainees, delivering a lecture on integrity in public service. She looked out at the room of eager, nervous faces and told them a story, not about her title or her rank, but about a woman who once stood on a sidewalk, holding a phone, risking everything just to record the truth. And when one trainee raised his hand and asked, what gave her the strength to stay silent? Ayanna smiled and said, it wasn't silence. It was restraint. And restraint, when wielded with purpose, is power. Now, I want to ask you something. How many times have you seen injustice and told yourself it wasn't your place to speak? How many times have you swallowed your voice to avoid conflict, to avoid risk? And what if the person you chose not to defend was the one building the bridge for everyone else? This story isn't just about a woman who fought the system. It's about what happens when someone dares to challenge it from within. It's about how pain, when channeled with clarity, can become transformation. About how standing up, even in silence, can shake the very ground we walk on. What would you have done in Ayanna's place? Would you have spoken? Fought? Stayed silent? Or would you, like her, have chosen to let the truth speak for itself, knowing the world wasn't ready, but needing them to see anyway? Tell us in the comments, what part of this story moved you the most? What did it make you feel? And more importantly, what would you do if the world turned its back, but you held the power to change it? If this story resonated with you, if you believe these stories deserve to be told and heard, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, share with someone who needs to hear this, and help us keep bringing real, powerful narratives to light. Because stories like Ayanna's, they're not just fiction. They're reflections.